Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, it's okay. Welcome to this session of the Young Seminars. We have two speakers. Robin Heinonen is the first one. Robin, he was born near Minneapolis in the United States. He got his PhD in physics at the University of California in San Diego in 2021 under the direction of Professor Diamond. He is currently a postdoc at the University of Rome, Tor Vergata, Rome 2, under the supervision of Professor Luca Biferale. His research focuses mainly on application of machine learning techniques to problems relevant to turbulence in fluids and plasmas. The title of the talk is Optimal Policies for Bayesian Olfactory Search. So you can please start, Robin.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the introduction and for the invitation. So I'm going to be talking about some past and ongoing work with Luca, as well as Fabio Bonacorso, who is at Tor Vergata, Antonio Celani, who's in ICTP, and Massimo Bergasola, who's at École Normale in France. So I'm going to start by introducing the basic problem in the relevant physics. So this work is inspired by biology. There are a number of flying insects in nature that depend on a remarkable ability to track the source of an odor or another cue, which is advected by the atmosphere. So one very salient and annoying example of this that's very well known to us is that of mosquitoes who are able to find humans by tracking the carbon dioxide and other odors that we emit in order to find a tasty meal. Another example that's very well studied in the literature is that of moths. During mating, male moths will track females using a single pheromone that the females emit by flying upwind, and they're able to do this over distances, very long distances, which may exceed 100 meters, which is remarkable. Flying insects aren't the only application of this work. It's also relevant to aquatic animals and certain robotics applications. But for us, flying insects are the main inspiration. So the question is, how are they able to do this? The first guess might be that they use a form of chemotaxis. Now, chemotaxis is simply the strategy to get an estimate of the local concentration gradient for whatever your search cue is, and to simply move up that gradient. And this kind of gradient descent will presumably lead to a local maximum in the concentration, which one would assume is the source. And this strategy works very well on small scales. This is what bacteria use when they're searching for food, for example. But on these long macroscopic scales in which we're interested, turbulence dominates the advection of passive scalars. And as a result, turbulence will mix the cue generically into patches or plumes of high concentration over a background of essentially zero concentration. And this will be a complex intermittent landscape wherein the insect will only detect the cue intermittently and essentially stochastically. And as a result of this, an insect will be unable to estimate the local concentration gradient because its signal is so sparse and intermittent. And just to illustrate this from a couple experiments, the top is an image of the kind of odor plumes that we're interested in. And again, note this complicated, patchy landscape. And on the bottom, we have a time series from an experiment. Oh, shit. Sorry. Okay, the time series from an experiment showing a concentration signal for propylene at a fixed location 50 meters downwind of a source. And what I want to highlight about this is that we had these long stretches of time on the order of tens of seconds where the signal is basically reading zero, interspersed with these spikes in concentration. And one can imagine this is the kind of signal that the insect will see as it flies around trying to find the source. And so how do you utilize this information in order to efficiently and quickly find the source is the main problem. Here's another image from experiment. The setup was that they had a source of moth sex pheromone in a wind tunnel, and next to the source they had a bubble maker. And the point of the bubbles is that as the moth flies upwind and tries to find the source, they can simultaneously track where the plume currently is by noting the location of the bubbles. And so these dark black lines with the filled in arrows represent when the moth was within the plume, and it generally tends to move upwind in such a case. And when it's out of the plume, for instance, which are these thinner lines, then it tends to move in these broad crosswind motions, which is called casting within the community. And one can loosely understand this as a way to try to find the plume again. So inspired by this, one early work on trying to solve this problem was by Balkovsky and Schraman, who introduced a heuristic policy, which they called cast and surge, wherein the agent has an internal clock, say tau, that counts the time steps since the last detection. And the agent then zigzags in a predetermined way toward the source in such a way that it depends on the current counter tau. And as the tau increases, it starts zigzagging further and further in broader and broader crosswind motions. And so that's the casting aspect. The surging aspect is that it initially moves upwind directly after a detection. And this is what we call a model-free approach, in the sense that it does not require any knowledge of the underlying statistics to operate. More on that later. So this kind of strategy has good qualitative performance, but one can certainly do better. And the idea of the present work is we're seeking a strategy which minimizes the time of arrival in some sort of rigorous way. So to define this, we'll need to take an aside into some background, which I hope is not too lengthy, but I want to be sufficiently pedagogical to those that aren't familiar. So now we'll be talking about Markov decision processes. So Markov decision processes are a mathematical framework for studying optimization problems in a stochastic environment. So we imagine we have an agent that's interacting with our environment, which is a proxy for the physical system, and interacts by taking actions from some predetermined set at each time step. And the relevant information about the system is captured by a state variable, say called S, which evolves according to a transition probability, which in general depends on the previous state and the action taken. And so note that this is, by assumption, a Markovian process. Hence the name Markov decision processes. And so then the agent receives a reward. This is an optimization problem. The reward is what we want to optimize. The reward is given at each time step according to some probability distribution that depends on the initial state, the final state, and the action taken to transition between the two. And in general, this can be less than 0 to act as a penalty. And now our goal is to optimize the reward by finding a policy that tells the agent what to do, what action to take when it's in a certain state S, that maximizes the expected reward, expected total reward, and it's technically a discounted reward. Gamma is a number less than 1, which you call the discount factor, which you can understand for the purposes of this talk as simply a way to regularize this infinite sum. So a first example of an MDP is a maze. So now in this problem, the state is the agent location, which can be any of these white squares. The actions it would take is it moves from one square to the next deterministically. And the agent starts, say, at S and tries to reach the goal G, and it receives a unit reward upon reaching the goal. And in this case, we would definitely need to take gamma less than 1 so that the total reward is gamma to the T. And in such a way, it's because this will incentivize actually reaching the source in a minimum time. A slightly more complex example, maybe more physically motivated, this is a classic example in control theory, is that of an inverted pendulum on a cart. So the goal of this problem is we apply an external force to the cart, which is free to move on a plane. And what we want to do is we want to stabilize this inverted pendulum, which is to say we want to minimize this angle, the magnitude of this angle with respect to the vertical called theta. And so the state of the system are going to be the generalized coordinates theta and x, the position of the cart, and their time derivatives. Say we can observe them. And the goal is now, since we want to stabilize the pendulum, this motivates a reward that penalizes first the magnitude of the angle. Secondly, that penalizes the magnitude of the derivative of the angle because we don't want it to fluctuate too wildly. And finally, a term to minimize the power output because we don't want to expend too much power. So we've been discussing what fully observable problems, but in practice, which means that we know exactly what state we're in. But in practice, this is not usually the case. So one example, in the maze example, you could imagine that the agent might start at an unknown random location and it has to figure out through exploration, say by interacting with the walls, where it is while it's trying to find the goal. In the previous example of the inverted pendulum, we can suppose that when we measure the generalized coordinates and the derivatives, they have associated uncertainties. And so we don't actually have a precise measurement of the state. So in such conditions, we now say the system is partially observable. And now all we can do is we make observations which supply information about the state through a likelihood, which we assume to be known, of those observations occurring given the current state and the action that was taken. In the example of the pendulum, then this likelihood would be some kind of Gaussian, assuming that the uncertainties are Gaussian and uncorrelated. So the final ingredient we need is Bayesian inference. So at each time step t, the agent will in general have a history of all the actions that it has taken and all the observations that is made. And so the question is, what does all this information say about the state? Well, assuming the system is Markovian, as we do, information can then be stored in a probability distribution over the states, which we call the belief, or if you prefer, the posterior. And then so what you do is you update the belief after taking your action, observing a certain observation using Bayes' theorem. And so the probabilities of each state will be rescaled by the likelihood. And this z is just, of course, a normalization factor and ensure that b is a probability distribution. And so this is called, not that we need access, once again, to this likelihood, which is why we call it a model-based approach. We need the model, the underlying statistical model. And now, of course, our goal will again be to seek a policy which maximizes the reward, but now the policy maps beliefs rather than states to actions. And so one final example is that of, which I think is illustrative, is that of Bernoulli bandits. It's another classic problem in decision theory. So imagine that you have k slot machines, and each pays out a unit reward with an unknown probability. So the question is what sequence of levers should you pull in order to maximize the total discounted reward? So this problem illustrates a very important concept in these kinds of problems, on partially observable problems in particular, where there's a trade-off between exploration and exploitation. By exploration, I mean that we need to discover the unknown probabilities by sampling. And exploitation, I mean once we discover those probabilities, we need to pull the levers with the highest probability in order to reap rewards. And in general, the actions necessary to do these two things are different. So we can cast this problem as a POMDP, in which case the state variables will just be the unknown probabilities, which are static. They have an identity transition. Our actions will be pulling the levers. Our observations will be the rewards that we receive. And of course, the observation probabilities are specified by the unknown probabilities. So as a remark, we can actually specify more or less explicitly the optimal policy for this problem as long as these are Bernoulli bandits. But in general, this is not possible. But what we can do is we can define what's called a value function as simply to be this total expected reward given the current belief under a certain policy and conditioned on that belief. So now the optimal value function, which is a value function corresponding to the optimal policy, satisfies what's called the Bellman equation, which is written here. This is a nonlinear functional equation for the optimal value function. which expresses the value function as a sum of two contributions, one from the immediate expected reward that for the action you're about to take, and one for the contribution of all future expected rewards, properly discounted by the factor gamma. And in principle, you can actually solve this equation exactly using what's called dynamic programming. But in the case of partial observability, this is basically impossible because we have a cursive dimensionality. The belief lives on a very large high-dimensional space, say a vector space of dimension, basically the size of the number of states that you have, which can be thousands or even tens of thousands. So now let me return to the original problem. So as a POMDP, we're going to separate space into a two-dimensional grid world. In general, you can do different numbers of dimensions, but let's stick to 2 for now. And so the state of the state is going to be where the agent is relative to the source. And of course, we don't actually know that because we're trying to find the source. And be easy if we did know. Now the agent will, at each time step, make an observation, which is either a detection or a non-detection. I'll be specific about what that means very soon. And then it moves into one of the four adjacent grid points, deterministically to be precise. And then the goal, just like the maze, is to reach the source in as few time steps as possible. And we remodeled the same way by giving a reward gamma to the t for reaching the source in t steps for some choice of gamma. Now, the key physics input in this is going to be the probability of making an observation, given your state. So to do this, we need to do a little bit of physics. I'm just going to show you the minimal model, which is very commonly seen in the literature, which is where you simply write down a vection diffusion equation with a mean wind and an effective turbulent diffusion, and finally a point source, say, at the origin. Now, you can solve, presuming you ignore fluctuations in the flow, then you can solve this equation for its stationary solution. And you can make a simple assumption for the number of detections per unit time, given the local concentration, which yields a detection rate, which has the following form. And the final step is to assume that the observations are Poissonian, and that we treat any number of detections greater than or equal to 1 to be equivalent. And finally, this yields an observation probability that looks like this, or graphically like the image above. And so the wind is moving to the right in this picture. So this is not the only way you can model, of course, but any model is going to have a couple of generic features which make the problem interesting and difficult. First of all, the detections are random. Secondly, the probability of these detections depends on where you are, and in particular, far from the source, they're rare. And typically it might be 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 even. So no talk on olfactory search would be complete without a mention of infotaxis, which is a very important heuristic that was advised for this problem. By heuristic, I mean you simply prescribe a policy with no guarantee of optimality. So the trick of infotaxis is that you try to maximize the information content of your belief, which is to say you take the action that minimizes the expected Shannon entropy of the belief that you will have after taking the given action, which then has this form. So this kind of policy prioritizes exploration, that is, you seek information about the source over exploitation. And in practice, we find it performs extremely well. And we can even improve it by adding some information about the distance from the source. And so any purported optimal policy will have to at least beat infotaxis and its variance, and this is quite challenging. But suffice it to say that so 3 papers from the past year, 2 of them I contributed to, and another from a group in France, have shown that that the POMDP solution is tractable and at the very least beats all known heuristics, which is non-trivial because on interesting problems we again have on the order of 10,000 states. I don't really want to go into the details of how the POMDPs are solved because it's quite technical and maybe not so much physics involved. And just to show you that we did something, here's a plot of showing that our near optimal policy, which is using what's called the Perseus algorithm in these blue stars, beat all known tested heuristics on a number of different test problems. Okay, so all this work that I just mentioned worked in an environment where detections were drawn stochastically and artificially by just pulling them from the imposed from an imposed model. But real men do DNS. So what we're working now is searching within a DNS. So we ran a number of simulations of the 3D Navier-Stokes equations with a mean wind in a turbulent regime, and imposed a point source of Lagrangian tracer particles, which are emitted at a fixed rate, which we then track over time. And this is a two-dimensional slice of one of the simulations. So now we need to turn this into a POMDP, and in order to do this, I coarse grain the data into a quasi two-dimensional slice, and then into a grid. And then you can simply count the number of particles in each grid in order to get a proxy for a coarse grain concentration field, which then looks something like this. You can take a moment to ooh and ah on this, and then we can move on. So finally, how do we define a detection? Well, so to do this, we simply impose a threshold. So when the agent is in a square and it counts the number of particles in the square, and if it exceeds that threshold, then we call that a detection. So the final step is then to fit the data for the probability of being above threshold averaged over time. We need to fit this to a model. We chose a model that was in a paper I don't really have time to talk about, but it's by Antonio Celani, and it has the following form. But suffice it to say that the fit is quite good, if slightly imperfect. And then the final step, once we have the fit, then we can use our favorite POMDP solver in order to solve for a near optimal policy. And when you do this, this is the kind of thing that you get. So the green curve is going to be our near optimal policy. The other two are versions of infotaxis. And you'll see in this example that our near optimal policy is kind of blowing the other two out of the water. But another interesting thing to note is that all of these policies, despite prescribing this behavior in no explicit way, somehow have kind of zigzaggy cast and surge-like behavior emergent, which is a very interesting observation that I don't think anyone really fully understands in the community. I'll wait for the last policy to finish. Okay. So finally, I don't really want to go into detail because these results are quite fresh and I don't entirely understand them. But you could then obtain arrival time PDFs for your various policies. And the thing I want to highlight, which I find interesting, is that despite all this work to do optimization, somehow these heuristics are very close to optimal, and by the naked eye, it is hard to distinguish the PDFs. So I'm going to wrap it up now, but I hope I convinced you that olfactory search is a relevant, hard, and hopefully interesting problem, and that by formalizing it as a POMDP, we can find a best policy in a somewhat rigorous way for a given model of the environment. So there's a number of directions that we're currently working on or thinking about working on in the future. So one thing that's probably easy to do, but we haven't gotten around to yet is, so what does the optimal policy look like? I know you noted these cast and surge behavior in the video a few slides ago. So we can quantify, say, the characteristic casting and surging lengths and compare to heuristics. Another thing to note is that we've assumed Markovianity throughout the talk, but as anyone who studies turbulence knows, there are correlations, spatial temporal correlations in turbulence. It's not Markovian. So an idea we're working on is to extend the POMDP to allow for short time correlations between detections. we've also been working in a model-based framework, but this access to an exact model of the environment is a very strong assumption that might be unreasonable for robots or for animals. And so it's of great interest to try to relax this assumption and make our policy more robust when we don't have access to the exact parameters of the flow. As I mentioned, we find that some simple heuristics are close to optimality, which is something that I don't think anybody understands, and I don't know if it has a simple answer, but it's something to study. And as a final thing that is maybe a little more experimental is that one notes that moths have a very narrow time window in which they can breed. It's on the order of a few days. And this suggests that the moth may want to take a risk-averse approach to the source, which mathematically speaking means that we, rather than trying to optimize the mean or the peak of our arrival time PDF, we instead want to suppress the tail and make sure that we're okay reaching the source as long as we don't do it in an extravagant amount of time or don't reach it at all. We want to avoid the situation entirely. So this can be formalized in a mathematical language as well, but it's much harder than the kinds of risk-neutral problems that we've discussed in this talk. All right, that's enough for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Robin. Are there any questions? I don't see any raised hand.
Don't all talk at once.
Sorry?
I said don't all speak at once. So it's a joke.
No, maybe I have a comment, but I don't know if I got it right. But it seems, I mean, the task seems so complicated that it's hard to think how a simple animal can do it. I mean, the maths that you showed us is so, it's complicated.
Indeed. I mean, certainly we don't imagine that the moth is sitting there measuring the parameters and and to say doing the calculation of the optimal policy. But I mean, so I mean, one basic reason we want to do this is it sets a baseline. Model-based policies are one of the main ways this problem is studied, and the optimal policy sets a very important baseline, even if it's hard to express analytically. We can at least obtain the statistics, and so we know how close we're optimal. We also imagine that these kinds of behaviors are evolved over time and probably will be close to optimal in some sense, even if that sense is not precisely known. I think for me, one of the major downsides of this is not per se the fact that we're doing this careful optimization, but rather this model-based assumption, which I think is almost entirely unrealistic. So there are a number of ways you can think about relaxing this.
Thank you. Okay, so I don't see any other question, so we can thank Robin again and move to the second speaker.